Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Dante Wright was shot to death by Brooklyn Center police after being pulled over for a traffic violation related to expired registration tags. Philando Castile and his girlfriend were pulled over by police because, according to the officers who murdered him, they just looked like people that were involved in a robbery. The officers added that Castile looks more like our suspects just because of the wide set nose. That particular traffic stop was not Castile's first, of course. According to NPR, it was his 46th stop. All the priors had been for fairly minor traffic violations. We know that Dante Wright and Philando Castile are not alone. According to the New York Times, over the past 5 years, police officers have killed more than 400 drivers or passengers who were not wielding a gun or a knife or under pursuit for a violent crime. This works out to be a rate of more than one killing per week. And a disproportionate percentage of those killed were and are Black. While 13% of the US population is Black, Blacks represent 39% of those killed by police while not attacking. But the harm that police cause during traffic stops is not limited to the killings of unarmed motorists who are disproportionately Black. Traffic stops for minor violations also increase the risk of arrest and detention, of car confiscation, of tickets, and related legal financial obligations, all of which also disproportionately affect Black motorists. Importantly, in many parts of the country, there's a huge financial incentive to stop motorists and ticket them. Revenues from tickets help fund government, and doing so in racially disparate ways allows law enforcement to assist in the extraction of valued resources from communities with too little political power to fight the injustice. So what do we do? Well, last month, citing strong racial disparities in traffic stops and arrests, Philadelphia City Council voted to bar police officers from conducting pretextual stops and searches for low-level motor vehicle infractions. It is the first city in the nation to do so, but Philadelphia is not alone. According to CNN, in Ramsey County, Minnesota, traffic stops for expired tags, broken taillights, and the like, in other words, non-public safety stops, will no longer be prosecuted as part of an initiative announced this week to honor Philando Castile. Measures to decriminalize driving while Black are spreading, slowly but surely, and have major implications not only for racial disparities in traffic stops, but also for disparities in police use of force. To help us make sense of this changing landscape associated with traffic policing, we have invited Columbia University law professor Sarah Seo, a legal historian of criminal law and procedure in the 20th century United States. Her recent book, Policing the Open Road: How Cars Transformed American Freedom, examines the history of the automobile to explain the evolution of the Fourth Amendment and to explore the problem of police discretion in a society committed to the rule of law. The book was named one of 2019's 10 best history books by Smithsonian Magazine, and it's received several prizes. Because I want Professor Seo to speak soon, I won't list all of those, but trust me when I say that it has been well recognized. Her book helps us to understand the legal decisions that have led to driving while Black. And ever since its publication, she's been advocating for the removal of city traffic law enforcement from police duties. Professor Seo, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and really for inviting me to share my work with you all. I have a slideshow, so let me just share that first. All right, so can you guys see this? Okay, great. So I really am honored to have this opportunity to share a little bit about my book, which I began researching because I was interested in the history on the war on drugs. And I sometimes say that I'm an accidental historian of cars, and it completely caught me by surprise to be in conversation with traffic policymakers, which I think goes to show how deeply connected the history of cars and the history of policing is in this country. And that's because in the 20th century, American society was, and still is, a car-dependent society, when nearly everyone, let's see, there we go. When nearly everyone drove or rode in a car, the traffic stop was and still is the most common encounter between individuals and the police, which the Bureau of Justice Statistics recently confirmed. This isn't new. People throughout the 20th century have been saying this, from a police captain in 1945 to law professors in 1966 and 1997. But as the title of Professor Skolansky's article suggests, people of color are over-policed in their cars. The Stanford Open Policing Project has shown that they experience a completely different traffic stop from white Americans. Consider Sandra Blon's experience when she was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. This is another example to add to the examples that Sandra gave in her remarks. She upset the Texas trooper by refusing to put out her cigarette, so he forced her to get out of the car and arrested her. After her death in jail, The Nation published an article that examined her life story, beginning with her birth to a single mother in Chicago's West Side. The article identified many of the setbacks that Sandra experienced in her life, which confirm how the themes of poverty and race in the criminal justice system are all too common. But there was another theme that loomed throughout the article, but was unnamed. Almost all of Sandra's setbacks in her life began in a car, from exorbitant traffic tickets that she paid for by sitting out in jail to arrest warrants for unpaid fines. She also struggled with mental health issues and was self-medicating, which led to several convictions for possessing marijuana that the police found in her car. In the United States, the automobile still is a site of violence, poverty, and discrimination. Cars didn't begin this way. For one thing, Black people didn't own cars or drive in significant numbers until the late 1930s, about 30 years after the mass production of cars. So in the beginning, the policing of cars focused on white drivers, or to use a historical word, everyman. Now, everyman sounds like a generic figure, but it was hardly class, race, or gender neutral. This term everyman conjured a white man from a respectable class. And this is one example of the use of the term everyman in this 1911 advertisement. The car was for every man. And it helpfully lists down here who every man is: the physician, merchant, salesman, so forth. And importantly for this history, as I'll explain later, every man experienced policing for the very first time when they started driving cars. The second big change that came with cars was in policing itself. August Vollmer, widely considered the father of modern policing, once said that comparing the police between 1905, when he became Marshal of Berkeley, California, and 1932, when he retired as its police chief, was like comparing modern civilization with the civilization of the Stone Age. And he wasn't really exaggerating too much. Before cars, the police weren't professionalized, they didn't investigate crimes, and the law strictly limited their authority. So to understand how we got from the Stone Age of policing to the present, we have to start when cars were first mass produced. Cars created havoc on public streets and highways and actually gave new meaning to the word traffic. This is a traffic jam in Detroit in the early 1920s. And cars could also be really deadly, as this headline from the New York Times in 1924 and political cartoons show. According to the National Safety Council, in just 20 years, death from car accidents went up 500%, while other deaths decreased by 42%. And so in response to this, cities and counties throughout the country passed volumes of traffic laws, which is depicted in this cartoon. But the problem was that everybody violated traffic laws. In 1925, newspapers reported that even Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover didn't always obey safety rules. He was caught jaywalking when he was in charge of the national movement for street and highway safety. So it was a huge problem when everybody, including the future president of the United States, violated traffic laws. So at an abstract level, it threatened the rule of law, while more concretely, people were dying from car accidents every day. So this law enforcement challenge made it clear that the way that laws or norms had been enforced wouldn't work when enforcing traffic laws. This was a time when police were few in number, even in big cities like New York and LA, considering the number of officers as a percentage of the population. And they focused on the margins of the society, the poor, the immigrants, and racial minorities. Everybody else was governed, or everybody else was, I should say, self-governed. They weren't policed. Historians often refer to 19th century self-governance as associational governance, because norms were often enforced by voluntary associations. And in the beginning, it was these organizations that tried to get their members to obey traffic laws. So a common example is the church, which enforced moral norms. So for instance, ministers gave sermons on, quote, Safety Sunday. And another example of associational governance at work is the Safety Pledge. 3 different associations listed at the top went around asking their members to sign the Safety Pledge written at the bottom, solemnly swearing at all times to practice all safety precautions and make the streets of California safe. You can guess how well this worked. And you can also see the transition to policing in the enforcement of safety laws. The Safety Pledge drive was undertaken in cooperation with the police department, as it says up here. This document captures a transitional moment. It's the associations that are driving the Safety Pledge, and they are the ones that are asking the police for help in managing every man who's driving. So by the way, associational governance hasn't completely disappeared. Consider NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, whose mission, according to their website, is to build cities as places for people with safe, sustainable, accessible, and equitable transportation choices, and so forth. This association sounds like something that the government does, but it's not a governmental agency. Associational governance has become more professionalized over the 20th century, but the idea is the same. Non-governmental organizations voluntarily coming together to promote a better governed society. Let me give you one more example of self-governance. This billboard in California perhaps even more perfectly captures the shift from 19th century governance to 20th century policing. It might be obvious today that the honor system wouldn't work, but people in the early 20th century really thought it would, because that's how much of society, or that's how much of society had been governed. Government leaders quickly realized, though, that old forms of governance were inadequate in an automotive society, and so they turned to policing. But 19th century policing also had to change. A different kind of police officer was required to enforce traffic laws because it turned out that people didn't like to be policed, especially people who had previously been shielded from policing because of their class and race. And this is a few old pictures of white gentlemen, one in a top hat, being pulled over for a citation. They complained that the police were being arbitrary or overzealous. So back to August Vollmer. He once said that a traffic cop needed the wisdom of Solomon, the courage of David, the strength of Samson, the patience of Job, the leadership of Moses, the kindness of a good Samaritan, the faith of Mary, the diplomacy of Lincoln, and the tolerance of Confucius. To put it more shortly, the job required a professional. So there are several aspects of professionalism, but the aspect that I want to focus on is exercising good judgment or discretion. So when we think of discretionary power today, we tend to think of arbitrary and discriminatory power. But when early patrol officers were trained to exercise discretion, it meant showing leniency, to give a warning instead of a ticket, or a ticket instead of making an arrest. Here's a grand jury report from Los Angeles in 1932, which addressed numerous complaints about the police's lack of courtesy. So the report suggested that the police force should be courteous in their dealings with the citizens. I want to focus on the word courteous or courtesy, because these words came up numerous times in my research. The grand jury report was just one example. It came up again and again in the trade magazine for police called the National Police Journal, especially to describe police forces that had been professionalized. You can see the blue arrow there. Here's this is from I think April 1920, which noted that the Buffalo police were trained to be courteous at all times. Another example is the name of Colorado's Highway Patrol, the Courtesy Patrol. South Dakota also had a Courtesy Patrol before its name changed to Motor Patrol in 1937. Here's a police training class where the lesson was on police courtesy. In 1957, the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics was adopted, which states that officers should enforce the law courteously. In some places, this was the rule. For example, San Francisco Police Department's rules and regulations mandated officers to act in a courteous manner. The Iowa State Patrol adopted the motto, Courtesy, Service, Protection in 1935. And in echoes of this history, the New York City Police Department in 1996 adopted the motto CPR, Courtesy, Professionalism, Respect. So courtesy, I argue, became an essential aspect of police professionalism because the police had to deal with a so-called law-abiding traffic violator or everyman. I don't think courtesy would have been so important if the police continued to police only the poor, the immigrants, and racial minorities. Courtesy became important because middle-class white drivers wouldn't obey traffic laws and they had to be policed. To put this differently, courtesy became important as a way to regulate the police's discretionary power. Officials recognized that enforcing the letter of the law at all the time not only antagonized drivers, but was also impossible because there were too many laws and too many violators. Courtesy was a way of simultaneously acknowledging the necessity of discretionary power while trying to limit that power. So officers had to exercise discretion, but they had to do so courteously. Of course, discretionary power was a double-edged sword. To explain, let me go back to the grand jury report. It recommended that the police exercise good judgment, which meant treating citizens courteously, but it also meant that some people should not be treated courteously. The report clarified that the recommendations did not apply to dangerous and known criminals, and that the police well knew who they were. And I'll quote here, I'm quoting here, there's a distinction between the class of offenders that every officer well knows, and it is this distinction that should be kept in mind. But in real life, it wasn't just criminal behavior that informed the exercise of discretion, it was also race. The phrase driving while Black wouldn't become common until the end of the 20th century, but driving while Black existed ever since Black Americans started driving in significant numbers around like I mentioned, around the late 1930s. I think it's very telling that one of the first letters to the NAACP complaining about traffic police coincided with the first publication of the Green Book, a guidebook for Black road trippers navigating Jim Crow on the road. Here's an NAACP report in 1937, a year later, about a police shooting of a Black teenager in a car. The state trooper brought the car to a halt by shooting at the tires, and then he shot the teenager, Stanley Jackson, in the face. After spending a month in the hospital, Jackson was charged for resisting an officer and reckless driving. Some things don't change, it seems. In the NAACP archives, I found a lot of files with stories like this from around the country throughout the 20th century. As soon as Black people began driving, they experienced not just discourteous policing, but also abusive, violent, and unconstitutional policing. Racism on the road became even more entrenched when traffic stops were used to pursue criminal investigations. The merger of crime control and traffic enforcement was pretty clear in the LAPD's annual reports, which regularly stated that it was avoiding the over-specialization of the traffic divisions so that they could help with other patrol work or other police work. And this is from the 1912 annual report from the LAPD, which noted that the traffic squad was also making arrests. Beginning in the 1920s, New York City officers inspected cars for safety violations, but they also quickly realized that at the same time, they could look for evidence of auto theft, which was one of the most common crimes in the 20th century. During National Prohibition, patrollers also used highway traffic enforcement to look for alcohol. I should note here that August Vollmer, the father of modern policing, was not a fan of having the police enforce traffic laws because he thought it would distract from their main duty of fighting crime. But in an automotive society, government officials thought that such multitasking was efficient. By the second half of the century, this multitasking became a full-fledged investigatory strategy. This is a best-selling textbook published in 1995 that detailed exactly how to do it. Note the title, Tactics for Criminal Patrol. The title reflects the complete merger of crime fighter and traffic patrol. According to the book, the strategy of criminal patrol begins with a traffic infraction or equipment violation. The book went on to say that this should be easy since a uniformed patroller's mere presence can provoke a stoppable violation. This is exactly what had happened to Sandra Bland. When she saw the state trooper in the rearview mirror, she changed lanes to give him the right of way, but she forgot to signal. And even if she had, she could still have been pulled over for failing to signal for a minimum of 100 feet. So these strategies are still used today, especially in poor and minority neighborhoods. Take, for example, the Milwaukee Police Department's Neighborhood Task Force Street Crimes Unit, which I learned about from a Seventh Circuit opinion in a case that ended in 2018, so very recently. According to the opinion, this task force was trained to look for smaller infractions and hope that possibly they may lead to bigger and better things. So this case started in January, evening of January in 2014. And this was, if you remember, right in the middle of the polar vortex. 5 officers and 2 squad cars surrounded a Toyota SUV parked outside a store with its engine still running, aimed their headlights, spotlights, and flashlights at the SUV, and ordered everyone inside to get out of the freezing cold so they could search the car. All of this police action began with a suspected parking violation. In this case, parking within 15 feet of a crosswalk. By the way, the crosswalk was unmarked and covered in snow. The Seventh Circuit opinion concluded that everything, the lights, the order to get out, the car search, followed naturally and legally from the suspected parking violation. The Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal in 2018, so the Seventh Circuit's decision is good law. In this case, the police did find an illegal weapon in the car, and the defendant was charged with felony in possession, which is why it became a legal case and went up to the Seventh Circuit. So one may wonder, what is the harm if society is made safer with these practices? And there are 3 responses to this question. First, it's not just guilty people who experience investigatory stops. A lot of innocent people also get the full criminal patrol treatment, even law professors. Professor Carbato at UCLA wrote about his own experience in a law review article published in 2002. Just 2 weeks after he bought his first car, he was pulled over. He and his brother were ordered to get out of the car with their hands on their heads. Without asking for consent, the officer searched the car. After finding nothing, the officers pressed them against the side of the patrol car and frisked them. The officers found nothing on them, so they let them go with no apologies for the unjustified and unconstitutional car search and frisk. Professor Carbato's experience is not uncommon. Every study I have read indicates that hit rates are low, meaning that not many car searches lead to the discovery of criminal evidence. The ineffectiveness of investigatory stops should question whether it's worth the detrimental effect on those who experience it. Not only are investigatory stops ineffective in fighting crime, they also undermine the main purpose of traffic laws, which is public safety on the road. Investigatory stops, or the possibility of one, have created a tense, unpredictable, and uncertain situation where everyone involved experiences fear. Drivers of color are scared of being pulled over. Police officers say that's one of their most dangerous tasks. We are doing something very wrong when everyone's feeling scared or anxious about something that's not supposed to be inherently dangerous. According to a paper published in 2015 by Professor Jordan Woods, only 1 in every 6.5 million stops resulted in the death of an officer. The rate of serious injury was 1 out of 361,111 stops. These rates are for routine traffic stops. Investigatory stops are a different story, but routine traffic stops are not dangerous. But everybody is very wary and scared of them. In addition to the practical points that investigatory stops are ineffective and counterproductive to safety, I would go further and posit that investigatory stops are not worth it because they're conducted disproportionately against people of color. This is based on the principle of equality, a fundamental principle in American democracy. Let me quote from Justice Scalia. He wrote, "As a motivating force of the human spirit, equal treatment cannot be overestimated. Parents know that children will accept readily all sorts of arbitrary substantive dispositions, no television in the afternoon or no television in the evening or even no television at all. But try to let one brother or sister watch television when the others do not, and you will feel the fury of the fundamental sense of justice unleashed. The Equal Protection Clause epitomizes justice more than any other provision of the Constitution." So perhaps investigatory stops would be fine if we all experienced it. But I think more likely if every man experienced that kind of policing, it wouldn't be allowed anymore. That's why equal protection is such an important value. It's also a good place to start when thinking about reforms. If every man experienced the kind of traffic stops that people of color experience, what sorts of policies would we have? So for one thing, I don't think getting rid of traffic enforcement would be the answer. Traffic safety is a real issue, and it's an important one. Studies show that low-income neighborhoods, which in this country overlaps significantly with race, have more traffic fatalities, especially pedestrian fatalities. A lot of this has to do with poor urban design in these communities, which itself has a long history, but also has to do with unequal access to public goods and services, including effective traffic enforcement. So how can traffic laws be enforced equitably? We could prohibit investigatory stops, but the problem is that this is really hard to enforce because it's easy for a police officer to deny pretextual motivations. Another way to get at this is to eliminate investigatory stops. Another way to do this is to reassign traffic enforcement to a non-police agency that doesn't enforce criminal laws. This is a structural way to separate traffic law enforcement and criminal law enforcement to basically undo the history of abuse that arose from the merger of these two functions. But this has to be done thoughtfully. Consider the case of New York, the city. Until the 1990s, the city had traffic agents, informally called meter maids. They were under the transportation department and directed traffic and issued citations for minor violations. But in 1995, meter maids were transferred to the police department. Why? Well, they were experiencing a lot of abuse from the public, over 600 assaults per year. One agent was punched in the face and had her jaw broken, and on another occasion, her arm was sliced with a razor blade. Another agent was assaulted by a priest who at the time was wearing his clerical collar. Traffic agents believed that the abuse would stop if they had the authority and status of police officers. This cautionary tale has parallels to the history I've told where civilian enforcement didn't work out and professionalized police with a great deal of discretionary authority were required to manage the so-called law-abiding class of drivers who were a pain to deal with. Although meter maids never became police officers, they traded their brown uniforms for blue ones to look more like the police. In 2015, there was a plan to replace the blue uniforms with green ones, which was scrapped when meter maids complained. Their union representative said these uniforms will make the job more dangerous for workers. Right now, people think we are law enforcement. And more recently, New York traffic agents criticized calls to transfer traffic enforcement back to the transportation department as part of efforts to defund the police, precisely for the same reasons. So part of the solution to the challenges of traffic enforcement may be public education. Although history has shown that lecturing the public about the importance of obeying traffic laws for the sake of safety didn't really work out, but I wonder, would it be more successful if we educated the public about how traffic enforcement enabled racialized policing? Could this history motivate the public to act more reasonably when pulled over for a citation so that we don't have to rely on discretionary policing, which harms people of color? If you're not optimistic about this, then there are some structural alternatives to minimize or even eliminate human enforcement altogether. One is better design of streets and highways that lead people to drive safely, even without thinking about it. The legal scholar Willard Hurst once said that the people who figured out how to draw a line down the middle of the road did more to enforce the keep to the right rule than anything the police could do. And there are other people who are experts at better design and can offer a lot more ideas as well. Another solution is automated enforcement. This eliminates the need for a traffic stop, and there's no discretion involved at all. This is probably why a 2016 survey indicated overwhelming support for more speed cameras among New York City residents who identified as Black, Hispanic, and lower income. We can use technology not just for speeding and running red lights, but also for checking for expired licenses and registrations, a common reason for traffic stops. Of course, it's important to accompany the use of technology with privacy protections, but with these protections in place, technology can increase public safety while minimizing police encounters. So this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. When thinking about what more can be done, it's important to consider history's lessons. It's also important to consider something as mundane as traffic enforcement from an equity perspective, and to include the perspectives of those who bear the brunt of discretionary policing. And I'll end my remarks there and open up for the Q&A portion.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that really terrific presentation. So it looks like we have a question in the chat to get things started. Vanita, would you like to ask your question of Professor Seo?
Sure, thank you. So I was just asking, you were talking about how perhaps banning investigatory stops may not be fully effective. What do you think about the Philadelphia ban of minor traffic violation enforcement? Do you see legislation like that being possible or useful in this context in Massachusetts? Thank you.
No, that's a really great question. I think one clarification, then I'll answer your question. Clarification is I support banning investigatory stops, but I don't think it can stop there. We have to go further because it's really hard to enforce that prohibition. And this is the one reason why the Supreme Court in the 1996 case Wren, which is an awful decision that basically permitted pretextual policing. And one reason why the Supreme Court did that is because they realized there's really no way to, it wouldn't work to ask a police officer on the stand, why did you really stop this car? And so the Supreme Court just gave up. And so my first clarification is I think prohibiting them is a good idea, but it can't be the only idea. And to answer your question about prohibition of citations for minor violations, can I ask a clarification question? Are those minor violations enforced at all by some non-police agency, or they're just not enforced at all by anyone?
My understanding is that they're not enforced, basically. You can't, yeah.
I think, well, I have a two-pronged answer to your question. One is I think there really does need to be a reconsideration of the traffic code, because there are a lot of laws that don't seem to promote safety. And so that's one thing. I just a reconsideration and to streamline and really revisit and make sure every violation does or every rule and regulation enhances public safety. I do think that the enforcement of traffic laws is important, and so for public safety reasons, it really does. The history of the fatalities, the deaths, the injuries, that's real. And it's a real government service to provide street safety. And so, and the enforcement of even minor traffic violations. And there's a little bit of ambiguity in what minor is.
Right. Sorry, to clarify, like police. So like if I think if you're caught on camera, you can still like get a ticket in the mail, but
okay.
No one would stop you on the road for those.
Yeah, no, I am for that. I think in anything, so that sounds like automated enforcement. And I like the use of technology because we still promote street safety by enforcing traffic laws, but you cut out the human part of it, the human enforcement part of it.
Okay, so thank you so much, Vanita. The next question is from Ashley Van Ness. Ashley, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thanks so much. I think you might have just answered part of it, but would love to have you expand. First of all, what a great presentation on the history here. I would love to have you go a little bit deeper on how automating traffic enforcement with things like speed cameras and red light cameras could mitigate racial bias. While many cities use this technology, Chicago, for example, there are a lot of pros and cons out there. So I was just interested in hearing a little bit more about your perspective, but you did start to answer this in your previous response.
Yeah, so I want to say, start with a qualification, which is technology is not a panacea. Technology has to be thoughtfully considered. It can be used for really bad purposes. The intrusions on privacy with the use of government technology, government use of technology to intrude on the privacy of people of color, especially, is also a problem. And so when I advocate for the use of technology in traffic law enforcement, it is with thinking about, we have to have the perspective of communities of color on the use of technology. We have to put in place robust privacy protections, and the placement of technology in neighborhoods and geography and all of that have to be done equitably and fairly. And so not to put, to focus on areas of high danger rather than speed traps, for example, so all that to say is I am for the use of technology, but for the use of technology in safe, considered, thoughtful ways, paying attention to the principle of equality, like I mentioned in my talk.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashley. So Leah has a question for you, Professor Seo. Leah, would you like to ask a question? Okay.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for the presentation. And I've had a chance to talk with you before, and thanks for all your work. We are the Vision Zero Network and work with cities around the country, many of which are interested in making some of the kinds of changes you're talking about to align traffic safety with equitable strategies and outcomes. And we're seeing how slow and painful that can be, of course. And I don't mean to circumvent locals' work, but I wonder if you've given any thought, or any on the call has ideas about, how can we move things more quickly, even the conversations around the need for change. Do you see a role or potential for more national or federal-led leadership on these conversations, just so that, again, we're not all, I feel like we're all working in our own worlds, really answering the same or confronting the same questions. So trying to get some thoughts on how we might hasten this work. Thank you.
No, that's a really, really good question. And the difficulty of police reform, not only on the issue of traffic law enforcement, but as we've seen with the failed, the George Floyd Act that didn't make it through Congress, is just policing is a local institution in this country, which makes reform so hard. But the thing is, historians have studied this a lot, which is the role of the federal government in influencing local policies in ways that a lot of people don't really notice. Through federal funding, the one common example is federal funding for highways that conditioned funding on minimum traffic regulations to make traffic regulations more uniform throughout the country. And so we can tie funding. The federal government funds local police departments, right? We can tie a lot of that funding to how traffic law enforcement is conducted. And I think money matters, right? And so if we want, I think we should work locally and federally. But I think in terms of, I think one of the most effective ways is to really condition federal funds to make some of these changes.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up is Skylar Martin. Skylar, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Something I'm kind of curious about is what you think about fines that are proportional to a person's income. People make different amounts of money, and fines that are set affect people differently.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting and really good question, because a $25 fine to somebody who makes in the 1% is nothing, right? But is significant for poor people, and so you have a different deterrence effect if the fines are set at the same rate for everyone. It reminds me of something that I read recently about how somebody knew the different ways that rich people think is a parking ticket is just the cost of parking, right? And so proportionate, that's an interesting idea that I am actually open to considering. I haven't thought through it, but I am open to that idea, because traffic enforcement has to be done on everybody, regardless of class, race, gender, because anybody who's speeding, for example, is still a danger. So we have to have that deterrent effect. But on the other hand, we can't have fines be so. The problem with fines and court fees and all of that is a huge problem for the poor and for people of color. It really undermines public safety in a lot of cascading ways. For example, if somebody can't pay a fine, they lose their driver's license, but they still have to go to work anyway, so they're still driving with it's not the big picture. Is we need to promote safety, and so I am definitely open to the idea of different rates for based on income level.
Thank you.
Thank you, Skylar. Next up is Lloyd McDonald. Lloyd, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I was curious about what you described as the automated enforcement initiative in New York, and what you reported was, at least initially, the significant support that it was receiving from the Black community in New York. What was the city's actual experience with it, and did that initial support of the Black community, was it maintained through the enforcement process?
That's a really good question. I think that was a 2016 survey, and that was the most recent thing that I found. So I don't know if they've done a follow-up survey. I haven't seen that, and I will definitely look into that after today. I actually don't know numbers in terms of the city's program. I know that it's cameras is part of the program to move into, what is it called when they charged to drive in Manhattan? I'm forgetting the term. They're going to add a
congestion pricing.
Yeah, and I think part of that is to have more cameras to do part of that work, and so I actually don't have the numbers and how many more traffic cameras are being used in the city or not. So I apologize, I can't answer your question.
So next up is Sophia Resin, or Risen. Sophia, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I'm curious about your thoughts on police officers carrying guns and how the presence of, police officers having those violent weapons is going to, if we try and, restrict the amount of weapons that the police force is able to have, how that will impact the amount of violent traffic stops? And also, I guess a more broad question, how do you envision meaningful police reform looking like? How do we go about actually tackling that problem, which is kind of a pretty complex one, but how do we go about trying to do so? Thank you so much. Again, it was really interesting.
So guns, it's a really, really tricky issue because it's not just the police with guns. So many people have guns. This country is a really violent country, and so I think, regardless of what I think about it, I just don't think proposing it would fly, because the police unions would definitely be opposed to taking away their guns. And so I think the more likely to succeed in terms of actually going through passing is to have unarmed, non-police agents enforce traffic. I think getting guns away from the police, I think as much as I want a gun-free society, I don't think that's realistically going to happen in this country. So that's my response to the first question. I wish I knew the answer to your second question. I thought the George Floyd bill had some really great ideas. Qualified immunity is a problem. I mentioned it a little bit in my book, where it can get a little bit technical, but an officer has qualified immunity if, well, I won't get into it because it's very legal and technical, but that needs to reform, and the George Floyd bill would have done that. Another really, I think, effective thing that the George Floyd bill would have done is to create a national registry of police officers who are fired for substantive reasons. There's this problem called the wandering police officer, where a police officer who's fired for misconduct on the job then goes to another police department, gets hired, and does the same thing in another police department. And so having a national registry would kind of overcome the problems that come from the fact that police departments are local in this country. So I think those two things would have done a great deal. And I think goes back to my answer to Leah's question of tying a lot of federal funding to police reforms, I think is a really good strategy. But I don't know. This is a really big question, and I wish I knew all the answers to it. But it's been a problem for a long time, and I think it's going to continue to be a problem that we need to address.
I think that's absolutely the case, but I do appreciate your responses to Sophia's question. So why don't we move on to Jay Wilberforce? Jay, why don't you ask a question?
Oh, hi. I didn't realize that I was going to be called on. I have a concern about in Cambridge since January. There have been relatively few compared to other cities, but there have been about a dozen shootings. Almost all of them have involved people in vehicles, people driving and shooting, and then making their escape. And I guess so. There's a world of traffic enforcement that there's a sort of a sense of innocence about traffic enforcement, that it's sort of like, well, somebody just made a mistake. But there's a world of vehicular crime, if you will, that involves a different a level of enforcement and even more risk than can sometimes be involved with police officers under the current sort of uh, protocols. So what do you say about a situation where you have drive-by shootings? What kind of policing do you imagine for situations like that? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's an important practical question that people are that we're confronting today with the numbers coming out in gun deaths. That's straightforwardly a police matter, and there are constitutional standards that apply to the investigations of drive-by shootings, requiring first reasonable suspicion to do a brief stop or questioning, and then probable cause to do more. And those are standards, constitutional standards that I think apply to any criminal investigation. What I do, if in the middle of a drive-by shooting incident, they also violate a traffic law, I think that's a separate matter. I really want to separate traffic law enforcement from criminal investigation. And so, and there's a role, whether it's the police or some other agency, but I think given the direction right now, it seems like the police are going to be still in charge of criminal investigation. They handle that. They don't deal with traffic law enforcement. Traffic law enforcement is entirely another government function. Now, the question that I often get from law professors who like to throw hypotheticals at me is, what if a traffic enforcer sees a crime unfolding? For example, a really extreme hypothetical, a murder weapon, a bloody knife or something in the backseat of the car. And a version of this that I get is the Timothy McVeigh example, right? He was caught with, I think, driving without a license plate, some traffic violation, was pulled over, and that's why he was caught. So my response is the Timothy McVeigh is really, really rare, and I wouldn't want to craft policy based on really rare occurrences, especially if on the other side, there's a lot of harm being done in investigatory traffic stops. And two is in terms of, what if the traffic enforcer sees evidence of a crime or something like that? That traffic enforcer becomes like any other citizen who sees evidence of a crime. They report it to the police, and then the police take over. And so I'm pretty set on separating traffic law enforcement and criminal investigation, and that they are separate functions, and merging those two functions has created a lot of abuse and has actually undermined public safety on the road, and also has distracted the police's function of investigating crime.
Thank you. So what do we know exactly about the likelihood that a police officer will be killed in the middle of, as a result of a traffic stop? Do we, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. So there's the study that was published. Let me see.
Is this the Jordan Blair?
Yeah, Jordan Blair. Let me bring up, let's see. It was really, really, really rare. Did you say police officer deaths?
Yeah.
I think it was like 1 in something like a million. Where is this? The problem with the Prezi is okay, let's see. It's really rare, yeah.
Yeah, the New York Times reports, drawing from Wood's study, that it's 1 in 6.5 million.
Yeah, that sounds right.
It's ridiculously low. And so it seems like we amplify the risks associated with traffic stops, while and weigh that much more heavily than the harm that gets done. At least that's my impression, that this fear that police officers will be killed when they stop someone for a minor violation seems to be really kind of magnified in our imagination in a way that's completely inconsistent with the facts on the ground. especially given how many cars get pulled over or vehicles get pulled over every year.
Yes, yes. And I want to put a plug in for this book that was published, I think it was this year when I read it. And now I'm blanking on the professor's name. She's a Georgetown law professor who wrote the book Rosa Brooks wrote Tangled Up in Blue. I don't know if you've read it, but it's really fascinating. She was a tenured law professor at Georgetown and decided she wanted to become a police officer. And DC has the only reserve corps in the country. And so she trains for a year and becomes a police officer with a gun and everything. And she writes this memoir about it. And it's really fascinating because her mother is, Nickel and Barbara, who wrote Nickel and Dimed?
Aaron Wright?
Yes, it's her daughter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So part of the memoir is about her relationship with her mother when she tells her mom she's going to be a police officer because she grew up in a household where the police were the enemy. But she decides to become a police officer, and she writes about her training, and she writes about her, I don't know, maybe it's 1 or 2 years as an officer in the Reserve Corps. And she has a little section on there about traffic law enforcement. And her explanation about all of this is really interesting. She says, I get why police officers think this is the most dangerous part of their job, even if the statistics don't back it up. It's because from day one in training, they're told that it's the most dangerous part of their job. They look at YouTube videos of police officers getting shot during a traffic stop, and that it's just in their psyche. And they're told that they have a right to go home safely. So she explains why officers feel like it's it's one of the most dangerous parts of their job, even if the statistics don't support that. And her take is the same thing. She thinks they shouldn't do traffic law enforcement. And so I recommend the memoir. It's really eye-opening.
I've put a link to the book in the chat, and so hopefully more of us will get a chance to read it soon. So let us go to Alana Safapur. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea that automated enforcement of traffic laws would take the people out of the equation and thereby eliminate bias is really attractive. But there's also a lot of evidence that artificial intelligence and technology sort of inherits the biases of their programmers, and this tends not to be the most diverse field. So what potential, if any, is there for racial bias to continue to be perpetuated in this automated enforcement, and what kind of mitigating factors can we put in place beyond the obvious of computer science really needs to diversify? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I look at AI when I teach adjudication, especially when it comes to bail hearings, because there's a lot of so some places are experimenting with algorithms to determine whether somebody's going to be a danger to society and determining bail. So AI is really dangerous, but when it's all about just kind of taking that snapshot of a license plate, that's not taking a picture of someone's face. Or capturing the speed. I much prefer a camera. So let me go back. The driving while black case that the ACLU litigated in New Jersey in the 1990s. They had a lot of data in that class action lawsuit. And one of the comparisons that they made was the amount of bias when an officer used a radar gun versus maybe just by using their own judgment or something like that. It was one using technology and one not. And the racial bias was clearly more when they weren't using technology. And so if we're choosing between technology with potential bias baked into it versus human enforcement, I would choose technology over human enforcement because it is an improvement in decreasing bias. But the next step is, I think where you're going at is how do we make sure that even technology doesn't have that baked into it. And like you said, we need to diversify computer science, computer programming. I think transparency is really important. A lot of the AI stuff, it's not very transparent. It's protected by trade secrets. And so it's really hard for activists and even defendants to challenge bias because we can't look into it. And so there needs to be more transparency, I think, in terms of how AI is used so that there can be more scrutiny. So those are some of my preliminary thoughts on your question, which is it's a really important one. And it's one we have to tackle because we live in a digital world. We're just not going to go back to a world where the government doesn't use technology. And this is the future now. License plate scan, automated license plate readers, police departments use that. And so we need to make sure that the government uses it fairly and in ways that protect our liberty.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So next up is Lynette Culverhouse. Lynette.
Thank you. Yeah, this may be a broader question than the topic today, but it seems to me that part of our problem as a society, beyond just the police department, is that we focus so much, almost vengefully, on punishment rather than restoration. And, even starting in our schools, we punish kids rather than trying to help them change behavior. And what it's doing is creating a whole lot of marginalized people who feel, unequal, unable to get a say in. And, so it's not just about police reform, it's about reforming our whole consciousness about how do we exist as a compassionate society that treats each other well. I mean, that's the shift that needs to happen beyond just police reform. So, I think the reason we have the police we have is because we have the society we have.
Can I be even more pessimistic than you? The way that legal scholars refer to punishment and what did you call it? Punishment versus
restoration.
Restoration. Legal scholars call it retribution versus rehabilitation. Those are competing justifications for punishment. And to be very pessimistic, there's a book written by a legal historian called, his name's Thomas Green. And I believe the title of his book is called Freedom and Responsibility in Criminal, the word freedom and the word responsibility, criminal responsibility were in the titles. But basically, he spent decades reading 100 years worth of law review articles written by the top law professors in this country, and to track the history of retribution versus rehabilitation. And there's been moments in American history, US history, where legal academics wanted to pursue rehabilitation, and the retributive impulse always comes back. And there's something about American culture that that prioritizes individual responsibility, because the flip side of the individual responsibility is deserving the consequences of your actions. And there's something about that in American culture where the retributive impulse is we can't shake it. And so that's the pessimistic part. What can we do about it? Because I think you're right. And I think this is a place for the arts. We need to change our culture. We need to change this through novels, movies, songs. I think it's a cultural change. And so I don't know, maybe you have different ideas, but I think, I don't think law professors or historians can do that change.
And education.
And yeah.
Much appreciated, Lynette. So we have about 3 folks up. So let's go with Lori Kenshaft first, then Hildy, and then DeMarcus. So Lori, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, so thank you. I was very curious about the responses of police officers to these proposals, to the statistics. I too have I've actually talked with police officers about their fear around traffic stops. I've heard that. I think I know the training exaggerates it. So I'm interested both in the response. How do we shift the culture around that sense of being at threat that police officers have, and then make other people at threat? And how have police officers responded to this idea of separating policing and traffic enforcement?
Not well. I've been invited to talk to transportation gatherings that include law enforcement. And I am, especially in person, I'm not sure on Zoom, but I am not a very threatening person. And I'm a historian. I don't matter in the world, but when I tell the history, it really offends them. And I think I've given 3 or 4 of these talks that to audiences that include law enforcement, and each time I rework it to see if there's ways for me to communicate with them without making them feel defensive. And I'm still working on how to communicate with them without them raising their guard. And I don't know. And so I've come away thinking, I don't think I'm the right messenger. I think it has to be it has to come from them. And there are police officers. I have met police officers who are open to this. They've looked at the data. And they've implemented reforms based on the data in their department and have been able to convince their officers that, that making traffic stops based on objective factors is more efficient, not just efficient, but effective than based on, other factors that are not tailored to dangerous driving. And so I think that the right messenger is important. I don't think I am that person, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully you'll convince a few officers and they'll percolate outwards.
Well, maybe I should keep trying to reach those few. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that encouragement.
Thank you for your work.
So next up is Hildy Shandell. Hildy, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. And then I have a follow-up to what you just said before. You spoke about how you told us how the study shows that the possibility of violence to the police is very low. The flip side of that is, are there statistics that you're aware of that show about the incidence of use of force as well as death that result to people who are stopped? And how is that being used to help it? Because what I've heard from law enforcement is if we stop 1,000 people and one of them results in a big cocaine bust, that's okay.
Yeah. So you're asking about the statistics in the use of force against the occupants of a car, right, please?
Right. The people that are being stopped,
Yeah.
whether it's the...
Okay. So I'm going to first answer it in a complicated way to say that I don't know. And the latest effort to get this data was in that New York Times reporting maybe last week.
Right. Okay.
And the reason why, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but and I think, Sandra, you might have mentioned it in your opening remarks, right? You said it was one death a week?
I'm sorry, that's exactly. Well, no, that is for killings. So 1 death a week for killings for an unarmed person who's not trying to attack.
Yeah.
So not for
broadening it, right?
Right.
So the reason why these statistics are hard to come by is because who has them? The police departments. And so actually, this raises a really important point. One reform item is better transparency of record keeping requirements. Some states do that. Some states require police to keep records of, traffic stops, on what basis and what the outcome of this stop is and all of that. And so that would be another important thing to include.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, next up is DeMarcus. DeMarcus, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Sarah, and thank you so much for your presentation. It's been very insightful. I wanted to ask about quotas, and I know a lot of police departments profess that they do not exist. But one thing that I've found in my work over the summer with the Atlanta Police Department is that they have performance evaluation points, which serve, to have the same economic effects, right? If they incentivize officers to stop people in ways that are disconnected from constitutional protections, undue harms on citizens, and public safety in general. So looking at the performance evaluation system in Atlanta, they receive 1 point on the performance evaluation for each successful traffic stop, 1 point for a ticket that they write, 3 points for a successful misdemeanor charge for a felony. And if an officer's professional livelihood and financial livelihood is tied to these incentives, I'm just wondering, has this been a point of analysis, of your own, or have you seen other researchers looking at this, because it's not necessarily a quota, but has the same effects?
Yeah. And I haven't done this research myself, so it's me learning from other scholars. And I think a lot of investigative reporters are looking into the issue of quotas as well. And a lot of this is, being able to get evidence from the police department about, their evaluation metrics and all of that, how salaries and promotions are done. But I think it's a really important aspect of police reform. You're absolutely right about that. And I think we need to change our understanding of what good police work is. And it's not, and I'll do another plug for Rosa Brooks's book, where she talks a little bit about this as well. But this is a super important aspect of police reform that you've identified. I haven't done this research myself, but I agree it is. And if you're working on it, I'd love to hear if you could keep me in touch on what you've done or what you're working on. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, DeMarcus. So we've basically run out of time. I was hoping, though, Professor Seo, that you might share a little bit about the book that you're working on now. Would you mind?
No, I don't mind. I'd love to. So, like I said, I became a historian because I wanted to know more about the history on the war on drugs. And so my next project is the history of federal conspiracy laws. And you might ask, what's the connection to the war on drugs? I got into this topic because I realized that in New York City, I read about how in New York City, after the city's settlement agreement on reducing stop and frisks, they turned to conspiracy prosecutions, conspiracy charges to basically conduct mass arrests of Black and brown teenagers. And there's this one mass arrest, which scholars refer to as the Bronx 120, where 120 young people were arrested for conspiracy. They might not have been gang members, but they knew of somebody who might have been. And so conspiracy is just a really broad liability that it basically is it makes it a crime to agree to commit a crime. And you can be liable for the actions of other people, even if you have no idea what they're doing. It's really broad. It's a really easy way. Prosecutors bring conspiracy or tack on conspiracy charges all the time because conspiracy charges are so easy to prosecute. And so it's really easy for them to get guilty pleas. And so I want to know how did we get these conspiracy laws? What's the history that got us to the present where they're just so easy for prosecutors to prosecute that they basically don't have to do much to get a guilty plea?
Right.
So that's my next project.
Well, I can't wait to read it and to have you back so that you can share with us about that as well. So much of what you just described reminds me of the gang registries that are that have proliferated across the country and how problematic those are. So looking forward to having you back. Thank you so much for providing such great insights. You've actually shifted my way of thinking about how we might take on police traffic enforcement reform in ways that I had not kind of imagined beforehand. So I really appreciate it. And I think our audience is really thankful to have you as well. Thank you so much.
I'm so thankful that you wanted to hear from me. So thank you for this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Have a good evening and we'll be in touch.
Good evening. Bye.